Some people fracture the moment pressure becomes personal. Others hold on for a while, convincing themselves they're fine, right up until the fault line runs through their identity. And then rarely there are individuals placed under sustained psychological strain, the kind designed to disorient, isolate, exhaust, and quietly dissolve a person's grip on reality. Instead of dissolving, they become sharper, not louder, not more aggressive, sharper, because what breaks most people isn't pain. It's confusion layered over time. It's being told, implicitly or explicitly, that what you see isn't real, that what you remember didn't happen, that your motives are suspect, that your character is unreliable. It's the slow erosion of certainty, the kind of pressure that trained professionals study, simulate, and sometimes still fail to withstand. Yet you walk through that terrain without losing your internal compass. That alone should make you pause, because survival under that kind of pressure isn't about willpower in the conventional sense. It's not about bravado or positivity or motivational slogans. It's about something deeper, something pre-installed. When the external world becomes incoherent, the only thing that keeps a person upright is an internal structure strong enough to remain oriented. When every signal says collapse, most people don't have that structure. They outsource their sense of reality to consensus, approval, and reassurance. So when those are removed or weaponized, they fold. Their nervous system panics. Their judgment distorts. They become malleable. You didn't, which raises an uncomfortable question. Not how did you get through it, but why did your system respond the way it did at all? Why, when the environment became hostile and unstable, didn't you disintegrate into resentment or submission? Why did you instead become more precise about what mattered and what didn't? Pressure like that is a sorting mechanism. It strips away what's superficial and leaves only what's structural. And what it revealed in you wasn't chaos. It was coherence, not rigidity, but alignment. A capacity to endure ambiguity without abandoning truth, to tolerate fear without surrendering values, to remain psychologically upright when it would have been easier to comply, collapse, or disappear. That doesn't come from nowhere. It doesn't appear overnight, and it's never accidental. Whatever shaped you did its work long before this moment ever arrived. But here's what they never understood. They were testing the wrong variable all along. When people hear the term psychological warfare, they imagine uniforms, briefings, and covert missions. That misunderstanding is part of the problem. Psychological operations, in their most effective form, don't announce themselves. They don't arrive with obvious authority or force. They seep in quietly through relationships, institutions, narratives, and prolonged ambiguity. They are less about attacking the body and more about destabilizing the mind's ability to trust itself. At their core, these operations aim to fracture orientation. They target a person's sense of what is real, what is stable, and what can be relied upon. This is done through repetition, contradiction, and delay. Signals are mixed. Feedback becomes unreliable. Intentions are obscured. Over time, the individual is placed in a state where every interpretation feels questionable, not because the truth vanished, but because access to it has been made psychologically expensive. One of the most potent tools here is gaslighting, not as a single dramatic lie, but as a pattern. Subtle dismissals, events reframed, suggestions that memory is flawed or motivation is suspect. When this happens consistently, the nervous system starts to lose its footing. The brain, designed to predict and stabilize reality, is forced into constant recalibration. That state is exhausting. Most people don't break because they're weak. They break because sustained uncertainty drains the very energy required to think clearly. Isolation compounds this effect. When social mirrors are removed or distorted, internal doubt grows louder. Humans regulate reality socially. When that regulation is disrupted through exclusion, reputational damage, or silent withdrawal, the mind turns inward without correction. Thoughts loop. Anxiety sharpens. Meaning collapses into speculation. This is not accidental. Isolation is not a side effect of psychological pressure. It is one of its primary delivery systems. Then there is the pressure of unresolved threat, not direct danger, but the sense that something could happen at any time. Consequences are implied but undefined. Accountability is selective. Rules feel fluid. This keeps the system in a constant state of alert. Cortisol rises, sleep degrades, emotional regulation weakens. Over time, people begin to comply not because they agree, but because they want relief. Confusion becomes unbearable, and surrender feels like rest. This is why psychological operations work so well on populations and individuals alike. They exploit biology, not ideology. They rely on the fact that most nervous systems are not built for prolonged ambiguity paired with social threat. The goal is not to convince you of a lie outright. It is to make truth feel unreachable. When that happens, people stop resisting. They adapt downward. They internalize the instability as personal failure. But here's the paradox they never anticipated. The very mechanisms designed to break coherence can, when they fail, strengthen it instead. When the idea of lineage is mentioned, many people instinctively recoil as if it implies fantasy, superiority, or superstition. That reaction is understandable, but it's also limiting. Properly understood, lineage has nothing to do with myth and everything to do with transmission. What gets passed down through generations isn't just eye color or bone structure. It's adaptive patterns, ways of responding to threat, thresholds for stress, instincts for meaning, order, and restraint that were shaped under conditions most modern people have never faced. Every lineage is the record of what worked. Generations don't survive by accident. They survive because certain responses to chaos proved functional enough to be repeated. When ancestors endured famine, displacement, persecution, or prolonged instability, they didn't didn't merely endure physically. Their nervous systems adapted, their emotional strategies refined, their moral frameworks hardened or clarified in response to conditions that punished weakness, confusion, and internal collapse. Those adaptations don't vanish. They are encoded, modeled, and subtly inherited. This inheritance shows up early. Some children are remarkably steady in volatile environments. Others seem able to tolerate tension without immediately externalizing it. This isn't virtue signaling or maturity beyond their years. It's regulation, a baseline nervous system capacity that allows stress to be processed rather than overwhelming the system. Long before language forms, the body learns how much pressure is survivable. That calibration doesn't begin at birth. It begins before it. Lineage in this sense is not destiny but predisposition. It sets the parameters within which character is formed. A lineage shaped by repeated exposure to betrayal, scarcity, or authority abuse tends to produce descendants with a heightened sensitivity to deception and power dynamics, not paranoia but discernment, an instinctive resistance to false reassurance, a preference for truth over comfort because comfort once proved unreliable. There is also the transmission of moral orientation. In environments where survival depended on internal cohesion, certain values were non-negotiable: loyalty, restraint, truth-telling, and delayed gratification. They weren't philosophical ideals. They were survival tools. Break them and the group fractured. When those values are passed down, they often appear in descendants as an unyielding internal line, something that cannot be crossed even under pressure. Outsiders may interpret this as stubbornness or rigidity, but it is neither. It is coherence under constraint. This is why some people respond to psychological pressure by collapsing inward, while others grow more aligned. The latter aren't immune to fear or doubt, but they don't lose their center. Their system has been trained across generations to remain upright when external structures fail. What few understand is that this inheritance doesn't make the pressure easier. It makes the outcome different, and that difference changes everything. The expectation that you would break wasn't rooted in malice alone. It was grounded in pattern recognition, just flawed pattern recognition. Most systems, whether social, institutional, or interpersonal, operate on probability. They assume that enough pressure applied over enough time will produce predictable outcomes. Confusion leads to compliance. Isolation leads to dependence. Threat leads to submission. These assumptions usually hold because they are based on averages, not exceptions. From their perspective, the conditions were more than sufficient. Stability was removed. Signals were distorted. Trust was undermined. Your environment was structured to keep you reactive rather than reflective. The belief was simple: sustained pressure erodes clarity. And once clarity is gone, control follows naturally. This wasn't an emotional judgment. It was procedural. They weren't watching you as a person. They were watching you as a variable. What they underestimated was internal structure. Pressure doesn't automatically reveal weakness. It reveals design. Most people rely on external scaffolding to remain organized: routine affirmation, predictable feedback. Remove those and their sense of self destabilizes. Their thoughts scatter. Their values become negotiable. They adapt not upward but inward, shrinking to fit whatever will stop the discomfort. That pattern is so common it's often mistaken for human nature itself. So the expectation wasn't unreasonable. It was just incomplete. They assumed confusion would disorient you. Instead, it stripped away noise. When contradictions piled up and narratives shifted, you didn't scramble to reconcile every inconsistency. You simplified. You paid attention to behavior rather than words. You reduced the problem to first principles. What is true? What is consistent? What aligns with observable reality? That shift alone disrupted their model because it removed the leverage point they were relying on. They also assumed fear would accelerate compliance. But fear doesn't have a single effect. It amplifies what's already there. In people whose identity is externally anchored, fear collapses the self. In people whose identity is internally ordered, fear sharpens boundaries. Instead of making you desperate for relief, it disciplined your attention. You became more selective, not more pliable. That response is rare, and it confuses those who expect panic. Another miscalculation was their interpretation of silence. Withdrawal was read as weakness. Slowness was mistaken for indecision. The absence of visible reaction was assumed to mean internal collapse. They were watching for smoke, never considering that fire might not need to announce itself. Psychological pressure never operates in isolation. While it is aimed at a specific individual, its effects ripple outward, revealing the internal structure of everyone involved. When you remained steady, the pressure didn't vanish. It redistributed. And in that redistribution, hidden traits surfaced, not because anyone intended to reveal themselves, but because sustained tension has a way of pulling masks loose without confrontation. Those invested in control began to show impatience. When expected reactions didn't arrive, their behavior subtly shifted. Calm strategies gave way to urgency. Precision gave way to excess. When influence fails quietly, it often becomes louder, more visible, and less disciplined. This isn't a moral judgment. It's a structural one. Systems built on manipulation require feedback. When feedback stops, they destabilize. Your restraint removed their reference points. Observers reacted differently. Some grew uncomfortable, not with you, but with the ambiguity your composure created. People often rely on emotional cues to decide what to think. When those cues are absent, uncertainty spreads. Instead of clarity, they experienced cognitive strain. Some resolved that strain by distancing themselves. Others aligned with whatever narrative offered the fastest sense of certainty. Very few tolerated the discomfort comfort long enough to think independently. This is how psychological pressure exposes dependency. Individuals who require external permission to hold an opinion quickly reveal it under stress. When the environment becomes morally ambiguous, they look for signals. Who is safe to side with? Which position will minimize risk? Your refusal to perform distress or compliance removed those signals. In response, many defaulted to conformity, not out of malice, but out of self-preservation. Then there were those who mistook endurance for accusation. Your silence was interpreted as judgment. Your stability felt threatening, not because you attacked anyone, but because it highlighted contrast. When someone is internally unstable, the presence of coherence can feel like exposure. That discomfort often expresses itself as projection, assigning motives, inventing narratives, attributing hostility where none was displayed. What became clear over time was that psychological operations don't just test resilience, they test character. Under sustained pressure, everyone reveals how they relate to power, and some reveals are more revealing than others. Something irreversible happens when a person passes through sustained psychological pressure without surrendering their internal standards. It's not that fear disappears or that uncertainty becomes comfortable. What changes is leverage. The usual points of manipulation no longer function the way they once did. Threats lose their sharpness. Incentives feel less compelling. Emotional hooks fail to set. The system that once responded reflexively now pauses, assesses, and chooses. Control relies on predictability. It depends on being able to forecast how someone will react when comfort is offered or withdrawn, when approval is dangled or denied. Most forms of influence are built on this simple exchange. Behave as expected and the discomfort stops. Deviate and it increases. But that exchange collapses when someone has already endured the discomfort to its fullest extent and discovered that it was survivable. Once the worst has already happened, at least been psychologically metabolized, the threat of it loses power. The nervous system learns a new baseline. What once felt intolerable becomes familiar terrain. This doesn't make a person reckless. It makes them difficult to rush. Urgency no longer overrides judgment. Fear no longer demands immediate action. The gap between stimulus and response widens, and in that gap, autonomy emerges. This is deeply unsettling to systems that depend on emotional reactivity. They function best when people are either chasing reward or fleeing pain. Someone who is no longer governed primarily by either becomes an outlier, not rebellious, not defiant, simply non-compliant with the emotional economy that keeps everything else moving. They can't be easily motivated by praise because they've seen how conditional it is. They can't be easily threatened because they've already lived through the withdrawal of safety. Another shift occurs at the level of identity. Before, there may have been a subtle reliance on roles, affiliations, or narratives to maintain coherence. After sustained pressure, those external anchors weaken or fall away. What remains is something leaner and more integrated. Values are no longer theoretical. They've been tested under duress. Decisions are no longer hypothetical. They carry memory. What makes this particularly difficult for others to understand is how quiet it is. There's no announcement of independence, no dramatic break, just a gradual decoupling from the mechanisms that once exerted influence. And by the time it becomes clear that control no longer works the way it used to, the window for reasserting it has closed, not through force, but through irrelevance. What emerges after prolonged psychological pressure isn't the hardened caricature people expect. You didn't turn cruel. You didn't become loud or domineering. The transformation is subtler and far more consequential. What formed is an internal gravity, a steadiness that doesn't need to announce itself to be felt. The noise fell away not because it was silenced, but because it no longer had a place to land. There is a noticeable economy in how you move now. Fewer words, fewer reactions, not from emotional withdrawal, but from precision. You learned the cost of unnecessary expression when everything could be misinterpreted or weaponized. Over time, that restraint became discernment. You speak when alignment requires it, not when anxiety demands it. Silence is no longer avoidance. It's an active position. Your perception sharpened, not into suspicion, but into pattern recognition. You became less interested in surface narratives and more attentive to consistency across time. What people say matters less than what repeats. What they promise matters less than what persists. This shift makes you difficult to deceive, not because you distrust everyone, but because you trust structure more than performance. Emotionally, something settled. Feelings still arise, but they no longer dictate direction. You learn to experience fear without obeying it, to acknowledge anger without becoming it, to feel grief without collapsing into it. This emotional containment isn't repression, it's integration. Each emotion has a place, but none are allowed to hijack the whole system. You also became harder to provoke, not indifferent, but less reactive. Attempts to pull you into conflict lose momentum when they don't meet resistance or explanation. You don't rush to defend your character. You don't scramble to correct every misunderstanding. Not because you don't care, but because you've learned that clarity doesn't always come from speaking. It often comes from consistency. There is a grounded humility in this state. You don't assume invulnerability. You know what pressure can do. That knowledge breeds caution, not arrogance. You don't seek chaos to prove strength. You avoid unnecessary battles because you understand their cost. Strength now is measured in sustainability rather than intensity. Others sense this shift even if they can't name it. Anchored people change the emotional climate around them. Conversations slow down. Drama loses traction. Urgency dissipates. This can be comforting to some and deeply unsettling to others. Those who rely on volatility to feel alive feel exposed by calm. Those who depend on control feel disoriented by independence. The real mystery isn't in what was done to you. It isn't in the tactics, the manipulations, or the sustained attempts to destabilize your mind. Those things were visible, measurable, expected. What remains extraordinary is that none of it succeeded in breaking you. The pressure, the chaos, the strategic targeting of every point of vulnerability. These were meant to extract compliance, to induce fear, to fracture identity. Yet in the quiet aftermath, it is not your collapse that is remarkable, but your endurance. The world expected you to splinter, but instead you held. And the reason is not simply fortitude or luck. It is inheritance, calibration, and the echoes of a lineage forged in the crucible of adversity. What allows someone to survive what unravels others is not merely willpower. It is structure, internal architecture built across generations, shaped by those who learned early that survival is not just about existing, but about maintaining orientation, coherence, and truth under relentless stress. Each instinct, each threshold for endurance, each capacity to see through deception and remain aligned with reality is a product of that history. You did not acquire it overnight. It was already present, embedded in your system long before the first attempt at breaking you began. When everything external became unstable, you had a foundation beneath you that others lacked. That foundation did not need recognition. It simply held. This endurance has a subtle, profound power. It is not the power of aggression or domination. It is the power of presence, to observe without collapsing, to act without overreaction, to see clearly when others are blinded by pressure. Perhaps the most unsettling realization for those who tried to break you is that they cannot undo it. The architecture within you has been tested under conditions they assumed would fracture it, and it has proven immutable. Fear has lost leverage. Confusion has lost control. Pressure no longer dictates your choices, and that is why your endurance is not merely survival. It is a signal, a living demonstration that some forms of strength are ancestral, cumulative, and beyond the reach of ordinary tactics. In the end, the world may never fully understand why it didn't work. The answer is simple yet profound. You come from a line of people who knew long before you that truth survives pressure better than lies ever will. That inheritance is not simply strength. It is orientation. It is coherence. It is home. And no one can take that from you because it was never given to you in the first place. It was already yours.